She was left a broken down shack in the woods. What she discovered inside changed her life forever. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Tucked between a phone bill and a grocery store flyer, Emma Caldwell almost threw it away without opening it. She was 32 years old, bone-tired from a double shift at the hospital, and the last thing she expected was a notice from a law office in Portland, Oregon. She set it on the kitchen counter, made herself a cup of coffee, and stared at it for a full 10 minutes before she finally tore it open. Her great-aunt Ruth had passed away at the age of 89, quietly and alone, in a small county hospital 300 miles north of where Emma lived, and she had left Emma something in her will, the only surviving relative she had chosen to remember. Emma hadn't spoken to Ruth in over 15 years. The family had written the old woman off long ago, labeled her eccentric, unstable, difficult. Ruth had disappeared into the Pacific Northwest woods sometime in the early 1980s, cut off contact with nearly everyone she had ever known, and lived in total isolation for the better part of 4 decades. Nobody visited her. Nobody really tried. The family consensus was that Ruth had chosen her strange, solitary life, and the family had chosen to move on without her. So when the attorney explained over the phone that Emma was the sole heir to Ruth's estate, she felt a cautious, almost embarrassed flicker of hope rise in her chest. Maybe a small savings account that had quietly grown over the years. Maybe some antique jewelry tucked away in a cedar chest. Maybe even a modest piece of rural land worth selling to a developer. What she got was a set of 3 old keys on a rusted ring, and an address that barely existed on Google Maps. Her cousin Derek laughed out loud when she told him about it at Sunday dinner. "They gave you a rotting shack in the middle of nowhere," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin and leaning back in his chair with that familiar, satisfied smirk he always wore when he thought he was right about something. Classic Ruth. Completely useless even in death. "Honestly, Emma, what did you expect?" Emma looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her plate. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Something, I guess." Derek shook his head and reached for the breadbasket. "Don't waste a weekend driving up there. Sell whatever land rights you have and be done with it." That woman was out of her mind. Emma said nothing. She folded the hand-drawn map the attorney had mailed her and slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of her jacket. 2 weeks later, on a cool Saturday morning in early October, she packed a backpack with water, granola bars, a flashlight, and her camera, loaded up her car, and drove 4 hours north from Sacramento toward the Oregon border. The highway eventually gave way to a 2-lane county road, which gave way to a gravel logging road which eventually became nothing more than a dirt track through increasingly dense forest. She parked where the track ended, checked her phone one last time. 2 bars of signal. Quickly fading, and started walking. The forest was thick and green and completely silent except for the soft sound of her boots on the packed earth and the occasional call of a bird somewhere, high in the canopy above. Morning light filtered down through the Douglas firs in long, slanted columns, illuminating patches of sword fern and Oregon grape that lined the path on both sides. It was, she admitted to herself, genuinely beautiful out here. She could almost understand why someone might choose it. Almost. She walked for about half a mile before the structure came into view through the trees. She stopped walking immediately. Her backpack straps slipped from her shoulders. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. The house, if you could generously call it that, was a collapsed, weather-beaten shell of gray and rotting wood. The exterior paint, which might once have been white or pale blue, had peeled away almost entirely, leaving long strips of bare, silvered wood exposed to decades of rain and wind. The windows were long gone, their frames gaping open like hollow eye sockets. The front door hung at a severe angle, barely attached to its frame by a single corroded hinge. The roof had partially caved in on the left side, and a thick carpet of moss covered what remained of it. Ferns had colonized the front steps. A small tree, maybe 10 years old, was growing up through what had once been the porch. Someone had painted a large red arrow on the trunk of a nearby maple tree, pointing directly at the structure. It felt like a cruel joke. Emma stood there on the path for a long time, hands pressed to her mouth, eyes stinging with tears she was determined not to shed in the middle of an empty forest. This is it, she thought. This is my inheritance. She almost turned around right then and there. She could feel Derek's voice in the back of her head, patient and smug and completely certain he had been right all along. But something kept her feet on the path. She took a long, slow breath, adjusted her backpack, and walked toward the door. She pushed the broken front door open carefully and stepped inside. The smell hit her first, a complex, layered combination of old wood and damp earth and something else underneath it. Something unexpected and almost pleasant. Cedar, she thought, and dried flowers, like the inside of an old hope chest. The floorboards groaned under her boots with every step. Shafts of pale green light came down through the gaps in the damaged roof, casting the interior in a strange filtered glow. Dead leaves and debris had drifted into every corner. A rusted wood stove sat against one wall, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor beside it. An overturned wooden chair, a broken shelf, the skeleton of what might have been a kitchen stripped down to bare studs and exposed. Insulation. The front room was a ruin. There was no other word for it. But as Emma moved deeper into the house, stepping carefully over a section of collapsed flooring, she noticed something. There was a second door at the back of the house, and unlike everything else in the building, it looked solid. No warping, no rot along the frame. The wood around it was darker than the rest, treated. She realized, sealed. Someone had taken deliberate care to protect it, and it was locked. Emma tried the first key, nothing. The second key slid in but wouldn't turn. She held her breath and tried the third key. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward slowly, releasing a breath of cool, dry air that was completely different from the damp rot of the rest of the house. Emma stepped forward and shone her flashlight into the darkness, and then she stopped breathing entirely. The room was perfectly intact. It was as if someone had built a room inside the ruin, a sealed, climate-controlled capsule hidden within a deliberately neglected exterior. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with hand-built wooden shelves, solid and carefully constructed, and on those shelves, wrapped in cloth, sealed in wax paper, stored in flat wooden crates and tall cardboard tubes, labeled in small, precise handwriting, were paintings. Hundreds and hundreds of paintings. Emma stepped into the room slowly, her flashlight sweeping across shelf after shelf. She set her backpack down on the clean floor, knelt beside the nearest stack, and began to unwrap the topmost piece with hands that she noticed distantly were trembling. It was a landscape, the Oregon coast at late afternoon. The sky a burning combination of gold and deep violet above a dark, churning sea. The brushwork was extraordinary, dense and confident in some places, gossamer thin in others. The light in the painting seemed to come from within the canvas itself rather than resting on top of it. It was, without question, the most beautiful painting Emma had ever seen in person. She set it carefully against the shelf and reached for the next one. A portrait this time. A young woman standing in a summer wheat field. Her face turned 3/4 away from the viewer. Expression unreadable but radiating something, longing, maybe, or defiance, or both at once. The figure seemed to breathe. Emma unwrapped another. A winter forest scene, all blue shadow and silver light. Another. A close-up. Study of hands and old hands. Folded in a lap, every line and knuckle rendered with heartbreaking precision. She lost track of time completely. At some point, she sat down on the clean floor of that sealed room, her back against the shelving, paintings propped around her on every side, and she cried, not quietly, the way she had been trying to, but fully and openly, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. Not from disappointment this time, from something much harder to name. Grief for a woman she had never really known. Shame for a family that had dismissed her without a second thought. All at the sheer, staggering scale of what Ruth had built here in the silence of the woods alone, with no audience and no recognition and no one to tell her it was worth doing. Just the work. Decades and decades of quiet, relentless, extraordinary work. Emma spent 2 full days at the property. She slept in her car both nights, woke before sunrise, and went back in each morning with better lighting equipment she had picked up at a hardware store in the nearest town. She counted 263 paintings in total. Some were small enough to hold in one hand. Others were enormous. Large format canvases rolled, carefully and stored in protective tubes that were themselves labeled and dated in Ruth's neat, precise script. The dates on the labels told a story of their own. The earliest pieces were from 1981, the most recent was dated just 8 months before Ruth's death. She had never stopped. Emma photographed every single piece. She created a rough catalog on her phone, organizing by size and date and medium, and then she drove home, sat at her kitchen table, and started making calls. She reached out to 3 different art appraisers. 2 of them were politely skeptical when she described what she had found. The third, a man named Marcus Webb, based in Portland, with 30 years of experience in American fine art, went quiet on the phone for a moment, and then said, "Send me the photographs, all of them, tonight." He called her back at 11 o'clock that same evening. "I need to see this in person," he said. His voice had changed. "When can you take me there?" Marcus Webb stood in the doorway of the sealed room for nearly 2 full minutes without saying a single word. Emma stood behind him, watching his shoulders, trying to read something in his stillness. Finally, he walked in and began moving along the shelves slowly, examining piece after piece with a small magnifying glass he pulled from his coat pocket, leaning close, tilting the paintings toward the light, whispering things to himself that Emma couldn't quite hear. After 3 hours, he came out and sat down on the front steps of the ruined house. He put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at Emma with an expression she would spend years trying to describe to people. "Your great-aunt," he said carefully, worked under the name R. Caldwell. I have seen that name before. 3 pieces attributed to her appeared at auction in New York in 1978 and 1979, and they sold for modest amounts at the time. She wasn't well known yet, but collectors began asking about her after those sales, and by the early 1980s there was genuine interest in her work. He paused, and then she simply vanished. No new work, no exhibitions, no contact with any galleries. She just disappeared. People in the field assumed she had stopped painting or died. Emma looked at the collapsed roof above them, at the ferns growing through the steps, at the small tree that had grown up through the porch boards over the course of a decade. She built a ruin around it, Emma thought. She hid the whole thing inside a broken house, on purpose. "What is it worth?" Emma asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "That depends on the authentication process and the market response," he said. "But Emma," conservatively, "you are sitting on one of the most significant undiscovered collections of American landscape painting since the 20th century. We are talking about a number that will surprise you." The authentication and cataloging process took 8 months. Emma took a leave of absence from the hospital. She hired a preservation specialist to properly stabilize the sealed room until the collection could be moved. She retained a lawyer and an art consultant. She said nothing publicly. The auction house in New York described the collection in its catalog as an extraordinary act of sustained artistic vision, realized in complete solitude over 4 decades. On the day of the auction, Emma sat in the back row in a plain gray blazer and watched strangers from New York and London and Tokyo raise their paddles for her great-aunt's quiet life's work. The final total was $4,800,000. Emma sat in the car afterward for a long time before she started the engine. She donated 30% to an arts education nonprofit in Portland that provided free studio space and instruction to low-income youth. She used another portion to fund the complete historic restoration of the cabin, working with an architect who specialized in 19th century Northwest vernacular structures. She kept 100 of the paintings and partnered with a regional museum in Oregon to house them permanently in a dedicated gallery. The exhibit opened on a Thursday afternoon in early spring to a small, private crowd. No splashy press release, no celebrities, just the paintings, good lighting, and wall text that told the story as plainly and honestly as Emma could manage. The exhibit was called Hidden Work. Within 3 months, it had drawn visitors from 41 states. Derek called her when the New York Times ran a feature on the discovery. His voice was different this time, quieter, careful, stripped of its usual easy confidence. "Emma, I had no idea. None of us did. If I had known, if any of us had taken the time to actually— I know, Emma said. A pause. I'm sorry, he said. For what I said. And for, everything. I know, she said again. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't really anything more to add. What stayed with Emma, long after the auction numbers and the museum opening and the magazine features and the phone calls from people who suddenly remembered how much they had always admired Great Aunt Ruth, was something quieter and more persistent than any of it. It was the image that came to her sometimes at night, just before sleep. Ruth alone in those woods, in that sealed room, in the deep green silence of the Oregon forest, painting canvas after canvas after canvas for 40 years with no audience, no validation, no reviews, no sales, no one to tell her she was brilliant or wasting her time, or doing something that mattered, just the work, just the daily stubborn, faithful act of showing up to the thing she believed in and doing it anyway. In a locked room, inside a broken house, in the middle of nowhere. Emma thought about that whenever the work felt thankless, whenever she felt invisible, whenever she lay awake at 3 a.m, wondering if any of it, any of the effort, any of the sacrifice, any of the long and unglamorous accumulation of quiet days actually added up to anything. She thought about a set of old keys on a rusted ring. She thought about a locked door in a ruined house. She thought about what had been waiting on the other side of it, patient and still and completely certain of its own worth for decades. And she got up, and she went back to work. Because sometimes the most valuable inheritance is not what someone leaves you, it's what they quietly show you is possible.